shouldn't be long, and I would like to introduce our next speaker. His name is Jeffery Bonkoski, and he is a retired hazmat worker, and he's going to go over a little information that we've all really wanted to know about how to handle these situations and how these types of chemicals that we are exposed to actually do cause harm. At this time, Jeffery Bonkoski. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak with you today. As was mentioned, I'm a retired fire captain from the city of Trenton Fire Department, which is just south of Detroit, up in Michigan. I have 27 years experience, and in that 27 years of experience, I pretty much trained and learned about everything I could that had to do with hazardous materials. The reason being is that when things go wrong, who do you normally call? It's usually the fire department. And we were being called to chemical plants, industrial sites, and to keep myself safe and to keep people that I knew one day I would be in charge to protect and work with, I wanted to make sure I knew everything I could about what I might be dealing with. I was also a paramedic, and as you can see, a tox medic, which meant that if you were exposed to WMD agents, nerve agents, etc., I could put on LAA, hazmat suits, and do treatments. I'm a female ICS instructor, fire instructor with the state of Michigan, hazmat instructor. I was a hazmat specialist for 19 years. I was a team coordinator for a 17-city mutual aid hazardous materials response team, a co-team leader for a regional response team, and for a short period of time I worked with the International Association of Fire Chiefs with their regional incident survey teams. And what we would do, and it's one of the things I would like to see start happening with some of these spills, is we would go to sites where there was a spill or there was some type of a chemical emergency, and we would interview the people. And it wasn't to take and look at it from the negative side, what went wrong. What we wanted to do is we wanted to know what went well. What did you do and how did you handle this that made things go right? And if you wanted to tell us what went wrong, great. What we would do is we wanted to know lessons learned so that we could create trainings from these lessons learned to protect people in the future if something like that happens. And I think it's something we need to start looking at doing with some of these oil spills that are occurring. We need to start interviewing the people that have handled them and find out what they did that they thought went well, what they did that they thought could be done better, and let's come up with a way to deal with these in a better way. Let's see here.
Is it turned on?
Let's see. Yep, there. Okay. First off, I'd like to give my hats off to the first responders. Having been one for so many years, when they first arrived on scene, they had no information, no idea of what it was they were dealing with. It's not like going to a fixed facility where when you arrive at the security gate, you say, I need a copy of the MSDSs. And you have no clue what you're dealing with. They were overwhelmed, and I'm sure they were just didn't have the resources to deal with what was going on. They needed to start out, and I'm sure they did, by prioritizing what their tactics were going to be. They needed to scare the scene, keep people away, because as you know, when something happens, people want to migrate to the area to see what's going on and what's happening, as well as media. We need to do an evacuation, and there's numerous books that you can use, and I keep them in my car, that give some type of a reference or a resource where you can sit there and kind of make a real quick estimation of how large an area may need to be evacuated. And when you do an evacuation, where are you going to relocate the people to? So in a lot of cases, you're going to be activating your emergency management. The next thing we need to do is your spill control. And you need to start looking at what resources you have available and how long is it going to take you to get your additional resources on scene to help out with this. Lastly, who spilled it? Who's going to be responsible? Okay, you're going to have something that's going to be a huge financial burden on the community. You need to know who it was that generated this spill so you can start getting some input in what we're going to do and who do you have as your spill contractor to get this cleaned up. Let's see here.
Question I had, this,
Yes.
wasn't this incident in Mayflower, isn't that a volunteer fire department or is it a permanent fire department?
Volunteer.
Okay, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, they have no contingency plans, correct?
Not for oil spills.
So that's your first problem right there.
Okay. And, you know, again, I'm not here to,
No,
right. I mean, and these are things that, what I would like to do, and as I, you know, go on and see, you know, these are things that need to be addressed, not so much just at a local level, but possibly even at a state level.
But
As
that's
a resource.
First of all, my name is Don Macker. Some of you I've met before, I think, and I bet you at the last meeting. But, we produce an absorbent polymer, which we've talked about in fiber needs at one point before. The initial point being that and what you address is correct, but this community is involved with a catastrophe that you guys have got no help. They don't even have the resources of who to turn to, because who they turn to for help doesn't have the adequate knowledge to say, this is the problem.
Not only didn't have access to those type of resources, but we're also threatened with arrest, criminal prosecution.
Because even from the last meeting, when I spoke to you last time, what you're meeting up, I think it was Conway, or at the school up there, was what, 4 months ago, or 3 months ago? The question was, what's going to happen to the community if this happens again? And the answer was, well, our next meeting is not until February or March or April, and the fire department, you know, has no plan, and they're not going to address it until the next meeting they have in March or April. But you're still stuck with the same problem. Who do you turn to? And the fire departments at the state, at the local community, at the county situation, at the state level, is not providing the information to the lowest level to say when in fact you have an oil spill, or when you have an oil tanker took over, or when in fact you have this happen. Here's a plan. The fire, and I've been in the fire industry too, but if it's top down, if it's from top to bottom to be fed, there's nothing there.
That's, like I say, that's something that needs to be addressed. That's not, you know, what I'm here for, or why I'm here. I'm just kind of here to kind of tell people a little bit about Hazmat 101 and what they need to maybe look to do in the future to correct basically things like you're bringing up. Now, when the first responders first arrived on the scene, the big question was what was being piped through the pipeline, because we know we've got a countless number of pipelines running through the state and through the country, and who knows what's being piped through them at any one time. Okay, and they can carry multiple products. Some of the problems is the products that are being pumped through the pipeline are a combination of chemicals. So you don't have a single MSDS on it, you may have multiple MSDSs on it to cover all the different materials that are being pumped through. Now the question comes up, you need somebody that can go through and decipher that information so that you can then isolate, let's say, the most hazardous, then start looking at what's going to react with possibly other chemicals that may be in the area. And there's a lot of things that you need to sit there and need to start looking at in all the different angles. Some of the other things that need to be looked at is air quality, air monitoring, LEL, UEL, your lower explosive limit, your upper explosive limit. We need to do monitoring to make sure that we're not putting people in harm's way. If there's a spark or something that can catch it on fire and you're within that flammable range, you're going to get some people hurt. You got to look at the health hazards. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I've got MSDS I'm going to break down a little bit. You need to look at the toxicity and reactivity, because there are chemicals out there that when they come in contact with other chemicals, they don't need an ignition source. The two chemicals mixing together gives you everything you need to have a fire, a spontaneous fire. Okay, so what laws and regulations exist to protect workers? And I'm gonna throw a bunch of things at you. And again, I'm trying to do this as a Hazmat 101. We've got the OSHA 29 CFR 1910-120, which covers your hazardous, basically material workers, people that are going to be called on scene. And it covers a long list of requirements that need to be made if you're going to be working with that. And then you got the 29 CFR 1910-134, which is the respiratory standard. Okay, if you're going to be putting on a respirator, if you're going to be putting on an air pack, okay, there are rules and requirements that you have to meet in order to wear those devices. And then I'll get into the Superfund, the NFPA standards, the 471, 472, and 473, and then the EPA 40 CFR 311. Okay, so the 29 CFR 1910-120 is also known as the Hazmat. And as you can see, it comes in and it gives you the 6 different areas that have an impact on firefighters or any other emergency worker. Okay, that's going to be called upon to handle or respond to these emergencies. As you can see, medical surveillance, I put that as the #1 thing. If you're going to get into this field and you're going to start doing chemical cleanups and dealing with responses, first off, you want to have a physical and you want to have a baseline blood draw. Okay, so that if through your career you're exposed to something that could have a harmful effect on you, when you get done at the end of the day, the end of the shift or whatever, you can have a blood draw or you can have a test taken, and they've got a baseline. They know what it was or what your metabolism was like before that incident occurred. We need to get into training programs, okay, because people need to be aware of the safety hazards, the hazards of the chemical, and what exactly they need to be doing so that they can handle the materials in a safe manner. We talked about the emergency response planning, as you brought up. Okay, that's one of the things that should be crucial. If you've got pipelines, you have industry, you have tank farms or anything like that, you should be looking at their emergency response plan. Many of these sites are required to have a response plan, especially if they're a fixed facility. Pipelines, not so much. However, if there's a pipeline running through, they should be giving you a book or a pamphlet on who to contact in case of an emergency. Okay, that should be with the fire departments. Okay, they should have something like that. Your incident management is crucial. Okay, we don't want freelancing. We don't want people going off and doing what they think is right without it being first approved. Decontamination, when we sit there and we start looking at incident command, we start looking at some of the things that we work under, the rules and regulations. Before entry is made into the hazmat sites, a decontamination line needs to be set up. Even if it's going in to perform a rescue. Okay, a decontamination line needs to be in place so that when you bring the people out, you have a way to clean them. Okay, so that then you can transport them to the hospital and you're not going to contaminate the EMS people, the ambulances, etc., etc. Okay, your equipment selection and maintenance. Okay, that's also covered in this particular standard. The 29 CFR 1910-134, the respiratory standard, again talks about the different types of respirators. Just a simple N95 mask, all the way to air purified respirators, self-contained breathing apparatus, or supplied air breathing apparatus. There's a numerous number of types. When you sit there and you wear a device that fits over your face, okay, it requires annual fit tests. Okay, you are required yearly to go through a fit test to make sure that that mask seals tightly on your face and that no gases can be drawn in when you're breathing. Okay, air monitoring. Okay, we want to make sure, especially when you're sitting there and you're using a cartridge type respirator, we want to make sure that the oxygen content is adequate so that you can breathe. Even though you got a cartridge mask on there and you're breathing, if the oxygen level isn't high enough, okay, if it's an asphyxiant or if it's something that's going to displace oxygen, okay, that respirator is inappropriate type to be using. And again, I bring up the medical evaluations. We want to make sure that people that are going to wear the respirators are fit and healthy enough to be wearing them, and it's because you are going to put yourself, your body in a stressful situation when you start wearing those. Okay, your 471, 472, and 473, the National Fire Protection Association. Again, the 471 is for your responders that deal with hazardous material incidents. 472 is for basically professional competencies, because not only do we need to have the training, but we need to make sure that the people that go through the training know how to do it. So what we do is we set up stations where people have to perform the different functions. We want to make sure that they know how to plug or patch a drum or turn a valve or whatever is needed. So we have competencies that we have to make sure that they can meet. And then lastly is competencies for the EMS personnel. Okay, we want to make sure that the EMS people are aware of the hazards when it comes to basically chemical emergencies and how to treat patients. And not only that, but keep themselves and the hospital ER safe from contamination. To get into how all these rules, all these regulations started, we're going to kind of go into Hazmat 101. And it kind of goes all the way back. I show on here in 1976 the Love Canal, but I'm going to take us back just a little bit further. And we're actually going to go back into the 1890s. Okay, there was a person, his name was William T. Love. And what he did is he had envisioned a community where what he wanted to do is he wanted to dig a canal between the Niagara River and the Lake Ontario. And what was going to happen is because at the time, the only electricity that was available was DC current. And DC current didn't travel a very long distance. So if you were going to have electricity, you needed to be close to the power source. So he was going to build this community, this canal, and he was going to use that canal as a way to produce electricity. And he began to get the financing, and he began to start digging this canal. However, this inventor called Tesla designed a way to turn DC current to AC current, which could be transmitted long distances, okay? And people that were supporters of and funders for this canal project decided to back out. Plus there was a little bit of a financial hiccup in 1893, which also kind of caused investors to back out. And then Congress passed a law which disallowed any water to be removed from the Niagara River. So everything kind of went against this Mr. Love and his project to try to get this community built. He ended up selling the property off, and it was sold to a Hooker Chemical Company, who began dumping chemicals in 55-gallon barrels and so on and so forth. They started doing that back around the 1940s. Then in 1942, they thought, here we got this ditch, or this one-time canal, which was about a mile in length, it was 50 feet in width, it was anywhere from 10 to 40 feet deep. And what they did is they allowed Niagara Power and Development to also start dumping there. And they allowed other agencies to dump in there. And finally, the area of the canal that was full of water, they pumped out, they lined it with clay, and then they continued to fill it in with chemicals and so on and so forth, making a huge chemical dump site. Well, in 1953, they stopped. They stopped dumping, and what they did is they put basically soil over the top, and vegetation started to grow on it. And because the area was starting to grow, the Niagara School Board says, hey, we want that property. The chemical company refused to sell it to them. Okay? They were persistent to the point that what they were going to do is they were going to condemn, they were going to try to, through eminent domain, take the property over. So instead of that happening, the Hooker Chemical Company, they came out with this little 17-sentence or 17 sentence clause, trying to give themselves indemnity and telling them that this property is in no way should be built on. Okay, it's a chemical dump site. We want to wash our hands. If you're going to build anything on it, we want nothing to do with it. Well, they went ahead, they bought the land for $1 and proceeded to come up with plans to build a school. The architect that was doing the plan designs, knowing what was originally used, or the property was originally used for, he told them that the school couldn't be built where they originally intended it to, so they moved the school 80 feet. Okay, but the playground was still over the contaminated area. As the population continued to grow, the school sold off some of the property to developers and they started building houses. And needless to say, when they started running their sewers, their water lines and everything else, they started punching holes through the clay liner that was supposed to be there to protect those chemicals from being able to leach out into the soil. And property. To continue on, we now move on to 1976, and we've got chemicals that are basically leaching up in the playground. Kids are playing in it, okay? We've got problems where we've got citizens that are developing higher than normal cancer rates, respiratory problems. We've got a lot of people that are having birth defects, children with birth defects, miscarriages, etc., etc. As it goes on, we see that the Hooker Company basically, even though they had sold the property and written this contract with the school boards to try to keep themselves from having any responsibility, they did take on some of the financial responsibility to clean the site up. And that's where we sit there, we get into the next slide, please. We get into some of the other things that led to these legislations, and that's the 1984 Bhopal, India incident with Union Carbide, where we had all these people that lived around and near the plant that were injured or killed because of exposure. And similarly, you may not remember, but in West Virginia, we had also another incident with the same chemical a few years after that, and it hospitalized 120 people. So as we go on, along with that Love Canal in 1976, Congress came up with their RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act. And that was an act to help do the cleanup of the Love Canal site. As it progressed, we had some other incidents. It's been rewritten many times, and we've gotten in '86 the Superfund Amendments, the Reauthorization Act, NFPA in 1987. That's when they adopted those rules and regulations for firefighter standards. Because again, firefighters are usually some of the first people to arrive on these scenes. And then in '89, the EPA with their 40 CFR 311, which refers to Hazmat. Go to the next slide. Now what I want to do, because when we sit there and we look at chemicals, and I mentioned the MSDSs, I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to bring up the MSDS for this particular one is benzene. And as we go through it, there's a lot of information, a lot of good information that are on these MSDSs if you know how to read them and what you're looking for. So usually, and there's a huge change that's coming. Before firefighters, we used to have, a real quick book. This book usually comes out once every 4 years. It's the DOT Emergency Guidebook, and it used to be a North American guidebook. However, coming up, they're making finally some changes, realizing that a lot of our chemicals come from overseas. It's now going to turn into a global system. And we're looking at some new placarding and new pictures and so on and so forth. And there's a training requirement that everybody and all the employees be trained to this new standard. I think it's somewhere in June or July of 2015. So one of the things that we look at is the first one, and also, let me back up a little bit, the requirement with the new standard is also going to change the format for MSDSs. So every MSDS you look at follows the same format. Before, when we used to look at them, you could get an MSDS on one chemical, and one might be health, on another one might be flammability, on another it might be, something totally different. There was no standard format that these MSDS sheets needed to follow. They're now going to have to follow a specific format so that if you're a responder and you arrive on scene and you're looking for specific information, you know you need to go to either step 4 or whatever it might be. So when we look at this, usually the first one is going to give you some information, emergency contact information, etc. 2 is your hazard identification. It's going to start talking about how it can affect you, as far as the eyes, skin, ingestion, etc. As we go through in the inhalation, chronic effects, carcinogenity, medical conditions, and so on and so forth. On the very bottom of this one, I took the time to go ahead and highlight the bottom part with benzene, because as you can see, OSHA and the Coast Guard require that a person that's been exposed to benzene in an emergency have a urine sample taken at the end of the shift, okay? And have a urine fetal test performed within 72 hours. Okay, so there's 2 agencies right there that all of a sudden say that, hey, we've got some real problems if you start having some exposures to benzene, okay? Go on to the next slide. As we go through now, we look at some of the flammability properties. When I talked earlier, I mentioned the LEL and the UEL. When we talk about the LEL, which is showing a 1.3 and the upper explosive limit of 7.9, what that's telling me is the range in between there is where it's going to burn. Okay, if it's less than that, it won't burn. If it's greater than that, it won't burn because it's too rich. If it's right in between there, that's where I have problems, and that's where air monitoring comes into play. We need to air monitor to make sure that we are within those standards. Okay, your auto ignition temperatures, your flash points, etc. It also starts listing some of the extinguishing medias, things that you can use if you have a small fire, large fire, firefighter instructions, accidental release and measures, and so on. So if we go on to the next slide, we talk about the handling and storage precautions, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I like to point out is when we do this, is if you look on line 8, it shows exposure controls and personal protection. Okay, we see that there's an OSHA standard, and there's a STEL, it's kind of hard to read, it got cut somehow or other. And then you got the ACGH, which shows a TLV, a threshold limit value, and a short-term exposure limit. I want to bring those up because those standards are basically based upon an employee at work in an 8-hour day. Okay? And what you have to look at when you look at that is, okay, let's say the company decides, well, I want you to work overtime. I want you to work 12 hours. They need to sit there and they need to look at his exposure and make sure he's not going to exceed that exposure during that 12-hour period. Okay, but now we have possibly a lesser parts per million, but you've got people that are here 24/7 being exposed to it. Well, you have a cumulative effect of what's taking place. So the whole time that they're in that atmosphere or around that product, they're being contaminated. And basically, even though it may be a minute or a very, very small amount, okay, it's going to be a cumulative effect on the body, and they are going to start seeing some of the effects that we've talked about. You know, the confusion and headaches and everything that's listed on this MSDS sheet. Those are what people are going to start experiencing.
So if it's at an 8-hour interval that they are doing this monitoring for, workers, why don't they measure it for residents that are exposed for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? Because that does not give the accurate reading of what we are actually being exposed to every day.
Well, that's one of the things that was possibly overlooked. People are taking these these short-term exposure limits, and they get tunnel vision. okay? And they don't realize that that's for an 8-hour exposure in a lot of cases, okay? So what happens is they look at how many parts per million they've got, and they, oh, it's not that much, it's within safe, we don't have any problems. But what they're not taking into account is the fact that you're there more than 8 hours.
Exactly.
Okay, and that's what, I guess we need to educate people on, okay? And that's where my training has come in.
Can you tell me what that number is, because I can't really tell, is that like 0?
I believe,
0.5?
I think it's just 0.5. I think it's 0.5. I think it's 0.5 parts per million.
And then the other, what is that?
The cell is 2.5 parts per million.
That's STEL, is that 4 hours?
What is that, what does that mean, is what was the question, yeah?
That's STEL is your short-term exposure limit.
Short-term exposure, okay.
Yes. And the TLV is your threshold limit value.
That's, TLV is maximum daily allowance, right? And the STEL is what, 4 hours of exposure?
UDA.
Okay.
Because they're taking into account a normal workday for an employee.
I can't help but feel that because these community exposures, the 24/7 issue has been ignored so many times and then brought up from the community, that's well documented that they're ignoring it on purpose. Because there's no excuse not to understand that people don't sleep in gas stations, that this is a 24/7 exposure. There's no reason to calculate it on a worker's 8-hour, 40 hours a week schedule. There's no reason for that when it's community exposure. They're overlooking it on purpose.
Right.
Well,
But that falls to the incident commander. That doesn't fall to the MSDS sheet. Because you gotta remember that the MSDS sheet was created for a short-term exposure of a guy being exposed to it, not for,
But when
there's no way they can cover that.
when they apply that to the community and say this is an educated, experienced professional that's making the determination that there is no threat to community health is where the problem lies. Because if they were actually educated, informed, and experienced, they would understand that this situation has occurred before and that they wouldn't allow it to continue to occur. They would stop using the 8-hour STEL when they know it's different for the community.
I think that a lot of the problem is that when an incident happens, incident commanders take the MSDS and just go off of that. I mean, I think that.
Then they need to be educated that if it's residents, they need to go off that 24 hours.
Well, we have federal agencies on site, the Agency for Toxic Substance and Research, ATSRD, we have EPA here, you know, representatives from the federal government that have experience, education, and training in these areas. There's no excuse not to take into consideration the 24/7 exposure limits.
Exactly.
Well, just to kind of, throw a little bit more into it, I've kind of asked where air monitoring was set up and where it was taking place at, were air monitors moved when wind directions changed, et cetera, et cetera. And seeing so much of that can play into this also. Okay, as far as air monitoring, when I had incidents, and again, I hate to kind of tell war stories, but what we ended up doing is we ended up going to a system where I could sit there and I could put out 16 monitors and monitor it from a central location on a computer. Okay, and I could set these in place and I could monitor the different levels and it would record it onto a computer. Okay. And again, the reason why there were so many is because of wind changes. Okay, I had incidences where I evacuated communities or sections of the community because at 5 o'clock, National Weather Service was predicting a wind shift. I didn't know if my emergency was going to be done by 5 o'clock. Well, I'm not going to wait till 4:30 to try to move 15,000 people out of their houses, okay? So at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm shutting down the street fair and I'm moving people out of their homes, okay? Because at 5 o'clock that evening, I've got the possibility of a windstorm, okay? And these are the things that should have been being looked at and monitored and kept track of. One of the things, what I did when I was in charge of my team is I actually had a form because like I said, I try not to do everything from memory, so it's nice to have little check sheets, little, reminder things that you have. So I created forms, and one of my forms was basically, if I was on an incident for a long period of time, I had a sheet where hourly, I could check in with the weather service and I could document what the weather was doing. And after that, I could also then document what my parts were related, or what my monitors were reading.
But here's the question. What kind of, you talking as a fire chief?
I was never fired.
Or, okay, as a hazmat coordinator? Full-time paid?
Yes.
Okay, you're not on a volunteer service.
No.
Okay. That's what they're faced with. They're on a volunteer service, and these guys are not going to know. The problem is that ADEQ for the state of Arkansas, when in this case there was a hazardous, let's call it a call out, right?
The thing is, and I know where you're going, but at the same time, even though there's a volunteer department in the community, in many instances, the volunteer communities will have mutual aid packs or mutual aid agreements
They don't have
with
that.
full-time departments where, or even within the state, you may have hazmat teams that you can summon and call, and they will come.
We don't have that in the state of Arkansas.
That's correct, they don't have it. See, so who's supposed to provide to the community this information? That in fact comes out from your ADEQ, which did not do, I would say, probably did not do their job to support you as a community with in fact the criteria that you're being requested to do here.
And again, that's where when I started talking at the very beginning, it's like, let's sit down with people that have gone through these types of incidents, find out what went right, what went wrong, what can we do to make it better, and then let's sit there and let's start to address it, so that if it happens again, because how many pipeline have we heard about, how many pipeline incidents have we heard happen since Mayflower? There's been a bunch. So they're going to continue to happen.
But
the people that think that the Pegasus pipeline is going to start pumping again,
This
yourself.
This is not all just pipeline related. This is in fact is community related, because whether you have a 20,000 gallon tanker driving down the road, or you have a rail car, you have the same issue that the community has to face. And I'm probably overstepping my bounds. The community doesn't know where to turn to get the answers for something that should have been in place 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so the on-scene coordinator, if it's the local fire department, which in fact it is, and in case and the other part being,
Bonner County Fire Department did come out to Mayflower, they did.
okay, but again, you're still running through the same problems day in and day out, which have never been addressed even to this point today, because if something happens when you get home and it's the same issue, who's going to show up? Your volunteer fire department, and you're going to still have the same problem. So I think what you're providing is extremely great information.
Most definitely.
Well,
But the problem that the community runs into is they don't know about this, and the ADEQ for the state of Arkansas is in fact the proponent that's got to force feed this information down to you.
Well, they've got to understand it first themselves. They need to be trained on it.
Well,
I mean, that's their job. They should know
you
what
have,
it is.
right here at Camp Robinson, okay, you've got the center for the state on emergency response, correct?
Yes.
Okay. That's where your operations center currently is. When this thing happened in Mayflower, somebody from there should have showed up and said, the air quality, as you had with the 16 monitors, they need to be in place. The evacuation plan is such that should be in place, correct?
Well, and I'll agree, and I'm going to just say that because I came from basically a city, a large city, I'm not going to say we had more finances available to us, but we ended up running into more incidents, and I didn't end up with 16 of these monitors just, all of a sudden.
Sure.
I was buying one and then buying another, and I mean, it took quite a while, and then you figure your maintenance and upkeep costs, etc. So, I mean, it's a huge expense, and it's something that, again, what has to happen is, when I showed my credentials where I was a co-team leader of a regional response team, in the state of Michigan, we have regional response teams, so that if you had an incident being a WMD, or weapons of mass destruction, or a toxic spill or something like that, where it exceeded the abilities of your community, okay, you can call on one of these regional response teams. And the reason why they were developed was for insurance purposes, to protect the workers that were going to be responding to them. And then what ended up happening is they were basically set up by the state, and you would fall under the state's basically protection when you went. And it was quite a thing, because I mean, we actually had police escort from the time we left our scene until the time we would get back. Okay, just to keep us all in order.
No question. This is all very useful information. I'm just wondering if in the course of your work you had to deal with proprietary chemicals, where
Well, proprietary chemicals are a real. I can't really use the words on that. But proprietary chemicals are a real problem because of the simple fact that, I mean, one of the main ones is fracking oils,
Yeah.
fracking fluids. Okay, they call it proprietary, and when we sit there and we start looking and we start talking about the MSDS, the fact that you want to go to the next slide, we'll go through the rest of these. Go ahead, go to the end of these. When we sit there and we go through, you can go to the end. This is some of the other things. One of the things I wanted to show on this slide, and I'll get back to your question, is you've got the NFPA's rating system. Then I put an arrow here on this other system for hazardous materials, and if you look, there is an asterisk. Okay, and I highlighted the health with a 3 and an asterisk. And if you want to go to the next slide, please. You'll see this is one of the new labeling systems that they're coming up with, which I think is a fantastic system, because it gives a worker a real quick idea of what personal safety equipment they need, be it goggles, all the way to respirators, gloves, protective clothing, etc. But when we get down and we look at the health hazard rating chart, the asterisk is chronic hazard. Long-term health effects may result with repeated overexposure. And that's what people are feeling. Okay, that's what people, even though it was a minute, it was a small amount, it was over a long period of time, it accumulated, and now you're getting those chronic effects.
As a hazardous specialist, coordinator, when would you stop air monitoring? Because they haven't done any air monitoring, I just looked, since May of 28.
Since May of 28?
May of 28. This happened March 29th, so,
Outdoors,
yeah, outdoor air monitoring, yeah.
90 days.
Basically when operations stop, but again, usually the air monitoring is going to take place as long as you've got people working. If you've got workers out in the field, okay, air monitoring should be taking place, because again, when I mentioned, okay, people should be going for medical tests if they're being exposed to different chemicals. Okay, and if you're looking at hydrogen sulfide, or you're looking at benzene, and you're looking at chemicals that can be flammable, air monitoring needs to be taking place. And if you sit there and if you look at some of those standards that I
it should
put
be
up there,
24/7.
it shows a requirement for that.
How can we request that? How can we do that through the current incident systems to enforce that they need to be doing this continual air monitoring?
But the initial point being that
That's the problem
his
with
initial-
the commander.
Yeah.
his initial point was, I think is overlooked. When you had the incident, within a day, or let's say within a day or two, individual blood tests will determine from then on the chronic aspect of your exposure.
Right, and
That was part of the problem we ran into though.
Right.
And that's not due to hazmat, that was due to the doctors. I myself was specifically told that they didn't want to be part of litigation, so there was nothing they were going to do for me. And due to this chemical exposure, and that's true.
But even if you think at this point that chemical monitoring or air quality should still continue to be done, you can still go back in. You can't go back to May when you started, but you can still do establish a baseline where you're at right now, and if in fact there are any effects continue to go forward.
And part of that problem is specialists in the state of Arkansas that specialize in these types of chemical exposure. And the research that I've done, they're few and far between, and they cost thousands just to get the lab work done. Well, if you
Yeah, and
don't have
insurance
health
won't pay for it.
insurance, it doesn't pay for it. So then we're kind of stuck in this leeway. We know we have symptoms, we know we've been exposed, but if we can't get a doctor to do these tests that we need, we're stuck.
But
And
there's-
that's,
But there was a gentleman that sat next to me here just a little while ago as part of your community, Mackie Strange, and you know. But one of the things that he brought up, right now you're not, even though you have a great action group and you're doing these meetings and so forth, but you're not unified as a community with one voice. You're a community that has, everybody's got a great idea, but there's no one person, in other words, being an attorney, that's speaking for the community. Because without a collective bargaining tool of being together, you've got 50 or 100 people all trying to accomplish the same thing with 50 or 100 different lawyers, and you're never going to be able to get back to the oil company because they don't care. And
You're exactly right.
if you speak with one voice, you know, you hire an attorney and it costs you $50,000 or 10% of which you guys draw in collectively as a community, I think you're going to get better results. But as you currently don't, in other words, I'm sorry that there's not medical treatment to give you that one blood test, but even as a collective group, you can go to and get the blood test and you can establish a baseline and you can do the things that you want to do. And the attorney that represents you as a community has a better negotiating point than you do individually.
Exposures are so varied and sensitivity is so varied. A lower amount is going to have a higher effect on a younger and older or someone with chronic disease. So blood tests in themselves really don't show anything. Plus, there's very limited approved medical treatments to address exposure versus leaving the area not to be re-exposed. It would be incredibly difficult to speak with a unified voice because of the different motivating factors typically are some sort of compensation for your distress. And we know it doesn't happen on a regular basis, and that's why the industry is allowed to continue to do these things. So regardless of just a unified voice in Mayflower, but a unified voice nationally.
Well, that would be very difficult to do, but that's why your laborers are able to be as successful as they are. That's why the oil industry is able to be as successful as they are because their union and or their program is unified under one thing, correct?
They're lobbyists.
They're lobbyists, but that's why, because of the
We're
tragedy that
non-paid
you all have.
volunteers. We don't have a steady cash flow to support our efforts. These are all things that we contribute from our own.
Oh, yes, ma'am, you're absolutely, but my point being is, as a community, with not knowing how the whole parade was set up, but if you can unify yourselves under one voice, your results are gonna be so much better.
We've continued to do.
We said that,
Yeah.
Emily and myself said that on day one. She and I both responded to the BP disaster. And on day one, Genevieve, what's the first thing I told you? Was to make sure that don't fight with anybody for petty things and make sure that, I mean, it's just, it's what happened. Unfortunately, that's what happened with all the people started fighting with each other, the communities, and that's a lot of times due to the PTSD and the stress of the situation. You have whole communities that have been there in southern Louisiana for over 400 years that are torn apart, families that fight. When that happens during an oil spill, I mean, it's almost impossible to get people outside of even, your own family together, much less the entire community. So you have to be able to facilitate, which is what we've been trying to do, meetings like this to where it's on common ground, everybody can sit here, we can work it out and try and talk with each other to figure out what we need, what steps needs to be taken to get that unified voice, but sometimes that doesn't always happen.
It's a
not.
difficult
you
task.
had a question. You've been raising your hand.
No, I'm
for a
sorry.
while. Go ahead.
Some of these chemicals that we know we've been exposed to have gotten into our house. So are these some of the chemicals that get into your carpet and into your couches and into your drapes and they just stay there?
You know what, I can't give you an answer on that. I would have to make some phone calls and do some research on it for you. I'm not gonna stand up here like I I've told other people, if I'm not sure, I'm not gonna
Yeah, that's fine.
try to
That's good,
BS
though.
you with an answer, just to make you happy.
Well,
Let
it's
me
been
res-
how
let me-
long
let
since
me
I've been in
research
my
that for
house?
you.
But every time I go back in my house, I get sick. I start having headaches, eyes are blurry, can't see to drive, nauseous, tired.
Let me do some research on that, and I'll
Thank you.
get your information, I'll get back to you. Like I said, I don't want to give you some false information. I won't do that. It's not my job.
Appreciate that, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, so what is the next step? And I sat here and I threw this one up. Okay? Your next step is speak with your vote. Okay, plain and simple. Right now, it seems like we're taking a step backwards. Okay, we're easing regulations on companies. We're sitting there, we're taking and reducing the powers of the EPA. We're getting, easier on corporations that pollute, okay, and are causing property damage and are causing these health effects. When in actuality, if anything, especially with people that are suffering from exposures, we should be looking at ways where they're sitting there and they're doing a study on people with these effects to find out if in fact it was their product that caused the effects. I mean, to just take on that responsibility and do that would put people's minds so much more at ease and help with PTSD, knowing that there's somebody that's finally listening to us and they're going to do a study and they're going to find out if that's it or if it was something else. Or, let's find out. I mean, I believe that we need to sit there and start looking at that. And that was one of the things early on with hazmat exposures. Okay, when I first got into the business, we had firefighters, we had people that were exposed, and guess what? They started doing health studies to find out what these chemicals and what type of effects they were having on people in their body. Okay, one of the other things I want to throw out is that if you happen to want to take a little tour of the cove, okay, and you need to sit there and make sure you protect yourself adequately. And one thing, do not wear leather. Okay? Leather cannot be decon. Okay? So, as I tell people when I do my hazmat training, because a lot of firefighters think these leather boots and stuff are really nice and they're lightweight and they're easy. Yes, they are. But understand one thing. If your leather boots become contaminated, they will sit there and they will stay contaminated. So every time you put those boots on, or every time you put that belt on or that leather, you're exposing yourself again to that product, okay? And if you bring those products home, okay, and you take them off of your utility room, now you're sitting there and you're subjecting your family to those chemicals. So yes, I mean, as far as leather, but as far as your furniture and your other things, again, I'll have to do some research on it. But anyway, let's see, you need to sit there and speak with your vote. I talk about the healthcare screening and monitoring to see about the present and future effects, because we know, your benzene can be a carcinogen. It's also mutagen. It can cause birth defects. Okay, and there's some other things. So we need to look into the future. As I said, I would like to see, a group put together where we sit down and we start talking to the responders. Because in all of my years, when I would conduct trainings and I would have EPA and the Coast Guard, and I would every agency that was willing to come and play and come to some of these trainings and exercises, we would invite them just for the simple purpose of getting their input on how we can sit there and make our response better. And that's what we need to look at. That's what we need to start doing here.
Did they attend?
Yes, they did.
How many of them have been
I
invited to our,
got training.
every town meeting?
Yeah.
They have been invited.
Yeah.
No.
I got training. I conducted trainings where I had the FBI, Homeland Security, Coast Guard, military.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
yeah.
Sean Johnson showed it the 6 months.
I mean, we've done some huge trainings, and like I say, I mean, the input you get in is great, and that's what we need to look at. We need to look at trying to get people's input so that when we are faced with crisis like this again in the future, because it's going to happen. Okay, how can we better prepare? I've got some ideas I would like to see, to help the state be better prepared. And one thing is I don't think a company that creates a spill should be the one that's in charge of the cleanup.
Amen.
Okay? They should be responsible and they should be part of the command
They
post.
should pay for it.
But well, they need to be part of the command center, but they shouldn't be in charge of the cleanup. Okay, because again, they're the ones that are paying, they're going to sit there and they're gonna save money every way they can.
Yep.
And I'm not trying to say that somebody needs to come in and just waste money, just frivolously, but there are products out there that work better than some of the products that they're currently using.
Yes.
Okay, and, I mean, and that's what we need to do. We need to get people trained in the state that can respond to these types of incidents. They can be a resource to the incident commanders so that these big companies and these big corporations don't start pushing them around and trying to make them think that, everything's being taken care of, when in actuality, they may be just scooping up a little bit, covering it up, and out of sight, out of mind. When they
Yeah,
have to
let's
still
just
there.
evacuate these 22 houses, because they're the only ones
Yeah.
that are in danger. And we want that number to be used over and over again on any news, not the hundreds of people that were actually contaminated by all the toxins.
I'm gonna ask a hypothetical situation. If you were actually one of the workers that was in the Mayflower disaster recovery and cleanup process, would you have evacuated a bigger area?
Well,
How would you
I was
have,
trying to find the weather data. I'm not sure how large an area they did evacuate.
they only evacuated the actual subdivision. They evacuated nobody from where all the
North,
content.
south, or west?
Well, see, I
They
would,
didn't
I
even
would, I would
evacuate the
have to
whole
look,
subdivision.
I would have had to look at the
Two
wind direction.
streets.
I would have had to look at the wind direction, number one, would have played a huge role. And then you might have gone like a quarter mile radius,
That-
okay, in all directions.
Well, from where I live to the actual subdivision is only a
The
mile.
school,
Right.
and how many of those kids went home?
And the cove to my vicinity is about 350 yards. We're almost the 200.
That's where air monitoring becomes so important, because like I said, I can sit there and I can do plume projections, where if you give me the source where the leak is, or where the spill is, and how far, or whatever the extent of it, okay, I can start pinpointing it, and then based on the wind direction, I can tell you how far, based upon wind speed and everything else, that's going and in which direction. Okay, so while they may have done the sub, if the wind was blowing towards you, you might have been within the evacuation zone, even though the spill was going in the opposite direction.
Right.
Okay, the spill might have been going downhill, but the vapors might
Who
have
makes
been
that
going.
initial call?
Pardon?
Who makes that initial call?
It should be your incident commander. Based on,
Department of Human
again,
Services was part of it.
when I sat there and I started bringing, I mean, there's some quick information that he can sit there and he has at his disposal, where he can sit there and look up in a book,
But your initial,
and based on
but the
that,
follow-up is your incident commander is who?
generally, I mean, it
Your fire-
changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction,
It's
but generally the highest ranking fire official
Correct. And it goes down to one
or
of
his
the
designee.
training. So if he doesn't have the knowledge and the training, because it's a volunteer fire department, there's nothing wrong with volunteer fire departments, your limitations are gonna be what he's aware of.
Sure, and then Exxon's sitting there saying, oh, this is all you need to
Oh,
worry
yeah,
about,
see,
well,
that's-
okay, I don't know, so I'm gonna go with what you say.
But you got an expert here, seriously, you got an expert here, because of the city that he worked in, that was exposed to continuous training, and has the wherewithal to know more than the average. Look at his
He
credentials.
should have been part of our hazmat
Can you
team.
move to Mayflower for
If you
a while?
if you could have been so lucky, but
Right.
because of his credentials and so forth, but it boils down to one thing. He's got the credentials because he's got the training.
Right.
So how do we bring that training here?
Well, doesn't it, I'm just wondering, like, I mean, when I work for EPA, there are hazmat teams in every state. I thought that was a requirement. I just heard somebody say earlier, there's no hazmat.
We do have a hazmat.
Well, you know, okay, it's no bigger than the state of Arkansas is, your hazmat team, and I'm afraid whether you put it in DOT, that's a problem. But if it's in, I mean, the state ought to come in and run this
But
thing to
it-
protect the residents, not the companies.
But
See,
doesn't
here's
it-
a little bit of your problem. When we sit there and start looking at these, and again, we need to sit there and we need to understand, and again, it comes back to training, okay? There is what we call the incident command system, which the fire department and basically a lot of your agencies are following. So when you have your hazmat teams, especially if they're coming from a different jurisdiction, even when I was with, as I said, I worked for 17 different communities, and sometimes I went other areas of the state. But when we arrived on scene, we did not take over control. Okay, we became a resource for the incident commander. And what we would do, and that's why, as I tell you, I'm not going to sit there, and I'm not going to try to sugarcoat anything, and I'm not going to sit there, and I'm not going to tell you facts if I don't know they're actual or real. Okay? I was there to sit there and give the incident commander basically my opinion on how it should be done. Okay, now, he could either say, yes, he wanted to go that route, or no, he didn't like the plan. If he didn't like the plan, I had to go back and redo it. Okay? So, we become a resource, but still, yes,
But
hazmat teams in the
it seems to
state.
me like now
should be-
the default advisor to the incident commander is the company that caused the pollution. And
Right.
they are telling the people, they didn't tell them what was in the pipeline. I mean, you know,
And as I mentioned, I mean, I'm sorry, but the company that caused the spill should not have been the one that was in charge of the
Okay,
field.
so
My
now what
opinion,
happens?
my opinion.
Genevieve's our daughter-in-law to be, and we went there on that Saturday afterwards. It was heroic. The smell was just ungodly, okay? That was probably 24 hours later. Still, what's going on? What's that smell? I don't know. Nobody knew.
They actually didn't start air monitoring over by my house until about 4 days later, when they had already pressure washed everything from the subdivision through the drainage system
And I
to my
can't,
area.
I almost fell out of my chair when I saw pressure washing.
Yeah,
All you're doing-
yeah.
All you're doing is just
Let's just
atomize
spread
and
it
put
around.
everything back in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So
When
really,
they
in other words,
tore down the last two homes, I was out there when they were tearing them down. I was out there for over an hour before they ever put out an air monitor.
And then she called me, the next day,
I
told me what it read, and I said, you need to get out of
No,
there.
that's while she was down there.
Yeah,
I was down there.
It was about, I think it was 10 times over the limit, over the exposure limit.
And seeing, when I sat there and started watching some of the pictures that you posted, one of the things that shocked me was the simple fact that I don't recall seeing any of the workers wearing respirators.
No workers wore respirators here, no workers wore
And-
respirators during
and as
any
you can see
oil
with benzene-
response. That's the problem.
And
The problem is the oil response incident.
I was informed that some of the people that were actually specifically working with Exxon, the contracted people, were told that they would lose their jobs if they wore them,
Yeah.
because they didn't want everybody to
Didn't want to panic. the
panic
public.
the community.
We just really bring it alive.
I'd like to answer that, but
Right.
My concern with that is that this is not just Mayflower, it's not just isolated with workers not wearing respirators. It's from 89 Valdez, it's from Torrey Canyon, it's from BP, it's from Ixtoc. I mean, every single oil spill in modern history, that every worker has never worn a respirator due to the threat of being fired.
well, again, that's because you're allowing the company that generated the spill to be the one in charge.
Right.
Okay, and that's what needs to stop. I mean,
How do
you're
we
not
make it
only, you're
stop?
not only putting the general public in risk, but you're
Yeah.
sitting there, you're putting the workers in risk. Now, when I sit there and you go, and I'll admit, if you go back up and you start looking up and bringing up some of the pictures of the Kalamazoo, because I know you've been, basically, compared to that incident with the M Bridge and the Kalamazoo River. If you look at some of the pictures that you can bring up on the internet with the EPA and so on and so forth, you will see some pictures where you got workers not wearing respirators, but you'll see a lot of them where they are wearing respirators. Okay, and again, a lot of that, because I was, worked shortly for one of the contractors that was part of the cleanup, and, again, they didn't allow workers to go on site unless they went through the training. As you saw, training is required to be on those sites. You can't just take somebody off the street, put them in a suit, and tell them you're cleaning up.
They did Mayflower, just hire them off Craigslist.
Yes.
Throw them out here, they don't know any better, let them get sick.
Well, I can't answer that either, but I know when you sit there and you start looking at companies that hire and deal with hazardous materials, if you look at the rules and regulations, with me having been a firefighter and having been exposed, my city legally has to keep medical records on file for me for the next 25 years. In the event I have any health effects.
Well, you have to.
Yeah, so depends upon the degree of post-traumatic stress of people in this country, because Rocks have companies, and a friend of mine used to work for one, and he said that they basically would stage things to make it look like it was supposed to look. And he went into one area, he said he could tell a certain chemical, he could smell it, he knew when it was a certain level when he smelled it. He went into one area, he did all the testing, and it came back clean. He said he knew they paid their company off.
Yeah.
And the company was willing to say whatever they would pay.
And one of the things, especially when you sit there and start digging, and you start getting into any pits or low-lying areas, I mean, one of the problems, one of the alts that has hydrocarbons is hydrogen sulfide. Okay, and just to give everybody just a quick heads up on some of the hazards of hydrogen sulfide, when you start talking about smelling, you need to be very, very careful, because hydrogen sulfide is one of those chemicals where you may walk in and you may get a strong scent, like a rotten egg odor, okay, and then it's gone.
Yeah.
It's because you become sensitized to it.
Right.
So you could be in a lethal concentration of hydrogen sulfide, not know it, and that has killed many people. Okay, because they've got just that real quick whiff, and it's gone, and they think, oh, it's okay to stay here, and they continue working and doing what they want, and then they become overcome by it. So again, air monitoring is vital anytime you're working around any type of chemical or hazardous material.
How do you feel about these secret chemicals or these chemicals that they don't want other people to know what they are? I really feel that is a big hindrance in being able to properly let the community or anyone that's around it know what they're really being exposed to.
It's a step backwards. We're actually regressing. You know, here we sat there and I went through basically the evolution on what started and basically why we came up with the rules and the regulations, the worker right to know. You've got, in fact, as an individual, if you go to the hardware store and you buy a can of
Aerosol,
disinfectant wipes,
Yeah.
you have got the right to ask the store for a copy of the MSDSs on this product, and they by law need to produce them. Might take them a while, but they need to produce them for you. Now, to sit there and have these proprietary chemicals and, you know, some of these other chemicals where they're not disclosing what's in them, yes, we're taking a step backwards. Now you're exposing workers, you're exposing people to chemicals that they don't have to disclose, so you have no idea what health effects they may have. And again, when I start talking about the leather gloves or the leather boots and so on and so forth that they may be using daily on their job site. Every time they put the gloves on, they're exposing themselves. Okay, if they bring the gloves home, they're exposing their family.
Yeah, the question to follow up on Genevieve's question from about 10 minutes ago regarding the initial evacuation zone.
Okay?
And in terms of determining the distance with which to evacuate, are you going on those kind of prescriptive papers, I forget what the name of it started with an H, in terms of the chemicals, in terms of what supposedly is in the pipeline, or are you getting through air monitors or some other way the actual chemicals that are present based on real data as opposed to these sheets?
Myself personally, because it was a pipeline and I had no clue whatsoever what was in the pipeline or how flammable it was. If air monitoring wasn't taking place and I didn't know what the LEL and some of the other things that we talked about was, I probably would have at least started out with a quarter to a half mile evacuation zone.
From just the rupture side or from where it all ended?
From
Also,
both.
From both sections.
Both.
Yeah.
So one of the problems
So
that
the
all the way around.
that everybody obviously understands, I think, is the fact when you don't know what's in there, and that it's proprietary, you don't know what, from the sheet, what chemicals that you're actually trying to protect people from, so how can you know how far to evacuate?
I Again, when I would sit there and I would make a call, I would rather err on the side of safety and go, you know, hey, if I sat there and if I went a half mile down and I sent a worker to you know, during the evacuation, they report back to me, yeah, I can smell it, we need to go farther.
They should have done that.
We
Why
need
didn't
to,
they do that?
we need to go
They didn't send
farther.
anybody out.
Right, we need to go farther with the evacuation. Okay, plain and
No,
simple.
this is in the subdivision, it's nowhere else. Let's just take care of them.
So basically, it's not really based on actual chemical presence in the neighborhood, it's actually from the sheets that they're kind of going on and making these decisions, right?
Correct.
Okay.
In many cases, if like say, you know, if they've got the DOT guidebook, the emergency response guidebook, and a lot of times there's an evacuation guide in the back of the book
Well,
that they can go to real quick and look it up and see.
I'll ask one more question on this line of questions.
Okay?
In that guidebook, is there anything specifically regarding tar sands oil?
No.
So there's a bunch of research that basically needs to be done so we
Well,
can.
again, when we sit there, we start talking about tar sands oil. Okay, what was going through the pipe was part of what was there.
Right. and
There were
the
other things,
chemicals.
there were other things that were in there, and that's why I said, that's what makes it so difficult. You can't just have an MSDS, a blanket MSDS that covers tar sands. Okay,
It doesn't work.
because the tar sands is too thick to be pumped through the pipeline, so you need to sit there and you need to add detergents and other products to dilute it to make it so it will flow. Okay, and now you need to sit there and you need to go through all of those MSDSs, sort through them, find out what the hazards are for each and every one of them. And so, I mean, it's time consuming. When we would get into doing hazmat calls, and it was one of the things I preached, and I still, when I do my trainings, I still preach. Hazmat is totally different than running a fire call. In a fire call, you want to get in there and you want to make sure, especially for life safety, that you get in and you try to extinguish the fire, you do your search and rescue, and, you know, time is of the essence. A fire will double in size every 30 seconds. Okay, however, we kill too many firefighters acting too quickly when it comes to chemical emergencies. So we need to sit down and, you know what, the product isn't gonna go anywhere, okay? Yeah, it's gonna go in the river, but we're gonna take steps, first off and foremost, to sit there and stop the spill from spreading any farther. That's our #1 priority. Let's plug and dike, do what we can to stop and contain the spill. Okay, now after we do that, we're gonna sit back and we're gonna start doing our research and find out what it is we're dealing with. But in the meantime, that evacuation needs to take place. There is no evacuation zone because, like I say, there's so many different chemicals that might be involved. Excuse me. There's so many different chemicals that might have been involved, mixed in with that tar sands, that you have to basically sort through and look up MSDSs on each one, find out what has the worst hazards, and then go based on that information.
I have one more question, I lied to you. And that has to do with how, well, I'll make it two parts, but the hazmat team itself, or the first responders, how they find out what's in the pipeline, and then secondarily, do you know of any regulations that would allow and inform the community, particularly in these pipelines like the Pegasus, where they change what's in them?
They can change.
And are there any regulations that suggest that that someone, at least the first responders at the minimum, would know what's actually in there when they make these changes?
Like, the pipelines are rather difficult to keep track of because, you know, they can sit there and they can be doing, you know, gasoline, and then they sit there and they put what they call a pig in the pipe, which basically separates gasoline, and then next thing you know, they could be doing diesel fuel. They can put another pig in there and they can start piping, you know, crude oil. Again, in a pipeline, it's not designed for a single specific one. The only one that's set up for a specific single item is natural gas. Those are about the only ones that, you know, if it's a natural gas pipeline, that's what you're dealing with. But if it's a petroleum pipeline, flip the dice.
Good luck.
good luck.
But it's all
You
based,
know, it's-
but it's all based on the incident commander making that initial call, regardless of whether he's on a hazmat team or whatever. He's the first guy in the scene that makes the call and says, this is the evacuation zone that we want to protect. And then when the so-called real hazmat guys come in, or the EPA comes in, or whatever, that's when in the case for you as a volunteer fire department, that's when the experts are there to fix and extend, if need be, what has to be extended.
The volunteer fire department here was not, that was not their role in this. They were supplemental. They were not leading the business.
Who was the first ones on the scene?
The first ones on the scene were the volunteers of the fire department, but they handed over command to Judge Johnson, who he was the incident commander. So he was at the top of that pyramid with Exxon. So I just wanted to be clear, actually clear that the fire department here wasn't necessarily.
But how long after the spill was the judge?
Within 10 minutes.
Yeah.
He was
But the
there.
fire department was still the active component.
For the evacuation
Not for the evacuation. They did start evacuating homes. You immediately start evacuating the impact area, the homes right next door. But it was, ultimately, that decision was made by the health department. Correct me if I'm wrong.
And
That's
in
right.
this situation, the Mayflower is a volunteer fire department, but it is heavily staffed by city employees. The water and street department workers also serve as part of the fire department. So they're very familiar with the community. They were indeed first on scene, but command was taken by the county judge in the Office of Emergency Management. They came on site and took over the operations. The hazmat team from the city of Little Rock was called in, who provided some frontline assistance. But once Exxon response team came on scene, it's my understanding that they took control of those operations. And just as healthcare providers use something that are known as universal precautions, basically if it's wet and it's not yours, you don't touch it, I believe that hazmat typically relies on this as well. That if there's an unknown hazardous material that's loose in the community, you remove yourself far enough away that you can't see, hear, smell, or touch it. And in that case, this wasn't done. There was a minimal area that was identified as sort of a barrier between the material and the community in some areas, but in some area, like the shopping center, there was no barrier zone at all. The shopping center was used as a rally point. There was equipment and workers, much traffic and contamination of that material in and out of the shopping center. I mean, the Subway restaurant was just right there. I mean, what, less than 25 feet, yards from the drainage ditch where all that material was forced. So as far as common sense or common hazardous materials procedures for this situation, I don't see as where they were followed at all. And I've never seen any real adequate, appropriate response to the community why they were not.
That in fact is the point. Correct me if I'm wrong, the incident command, okay, that person that's been designated or taken the designation is the guy that makes all the decision, correct?
He is ultimately responsible.
And so therefore, if in fact, which is the arm of the incident command center is your volunteer fire, but he, the judge in this case, there goes the judge.
He was appointed.
They publicly said it was a unified incident command. No one member of the team came out singly to make any kind of decision or determination. It was a unified incident command team, so they all had a say-so in those final decisions.
I'm going to kind of step in here just a little bit again, being a nice instructor. When we sit there, we talk about the incident command and the unified command, which is a great way to handle large scenes. There is still ultimately one person that's in charge, okay, which is your incident commander. Everybody in the unified command system, okay, they work together. But the incident commander is usually still the one that's responsible.
I believe that would have been our county judge.
He can say yay or nay. In fact, just to give you a great example, when we sit there and look at major catastrophes, and you have your press conferences, and you'll have the person usually that's in charge of the scene, and he'll have a big array of people around them, okay? Those are basically other people that might be part of the unified command system, where if somebody directs a question to him and he doesn't have an answer, he can look at some of the others around him that are part of the unified command system to address those questions. And ultimately, the incident commander is the one that's in charge, even in the unified command system.
So it's we, the people, have to take it in our own hands because we have OSHA laws and we have SWAT teams. Now, what are those two for? To protect people, right? Because we can see that danger on those, on OSHA, you know, somebody falling off a ladder or burning themselves or whatever. But this chemical that we can see and smell, but that they say, it's not gonna hurt you. We don't have anybody to say, look, you need to leave right now until we get this.
We did in this case.
You know, we don't have anybody to help.
We did in this case.
Now, why don't we? Government.
Well, again.
Of course, we the
guys
people.
talk about speaking with your vote. You don't have to go to the next slide. Perfect. I'm gonna sit there, I'm gonna do that. You know, go to the next one because now here. And I'm not trying to be political, I mean, I'm not trying to
No,
please
it's just the
anyone.
way it is.
But that's the way it is, and then when we sit there, we start talking again, and again, I'm not trying to be political again, but we sit there, we start looking at the ACA and people objecting against it and not wanting it. But here you've got how many people in your community that have been exposed and are having health effects, that now if they're to go out and get a job, those are gonna be considered, okay, existing medical conditions,
I
pre-existing
want to
conditions.
clarify just one thing here. We still, at this time, have people sick in Mayflower that are within range where they should be evacuated. It's not over. They're still there.
Well, like I say, right now, I'm sure as the summer gets here, right now with the colder temperatures, again, we start looking at vapor concentrations. Right now with the cold weather, it's gonna keep the vapor concentrations down. And as it starts to heat up,
It'll start bubbling like it's boiling.
that's
Yeah,
when
not everything's off gas.
air monitoring probably needs to be taking place.
Yes, it was.
And you know what, that's something that, you know, again, that, you know, being that there's been a release, they need to sit there and they look. And I can see them, unfortunately, like I say, there are products that are out there that could have handled the situation so much better than what was done. And, you know, unfortunately, when it comes to some of these products, you know, some of these products have already been tested and approved by the EPA, by the Coast Guard, by other agencies. Unfortunately, they're not being looked at or they're not being utilized here. And that's where, again, you know, we need to sit there, we need to look at training people here. And we need to look at preventing or being prepared for something like this to happen again in the future. Okay, we need to look at that. We need to start addressing the issues, and what better way to do it than, you know, get together with people and talk about what happened, how it was handled, what can be done to make it so that if it happens again, we can react better and be stronger.
Jeff, you mentioned that you did this response assessment team where people, you go in and talk to people
Correct.
after an incident. I don't know if that's happened here. Is there a way that Mayflower can request something like that where people could come in? Because what happened here could happen elsewhere.
It will happen elsewhere.
Well, you know,
It'll probably happen here again.
yeah, my son's an EMT. When the federal building in Oklahoma City was blown up, they did not follow any of the EMT triage provisions, so that was written up as a case study. But is there, I mean, usually there's an agency to do that or it costs money. Is there any way they could get volunteer experts to do an assessment like that if they could get the county and the state to cooperate and respond?
Well, I'm sure we could. Like I said, unfortunately, with the International Association of Fire Chiefs, due to funding issues, that particular group that I was part of has gone away because they lost funding for it. But again, it was a valuable tool. There are a lot of trainings that came out of that group to help protect firefighters. And not only protect firefighters, but it protected the public, because now we knew how to handle and how to react to incidents that dealt with those types of chemicals. Okay, and they were like chlorine and ammonia, and I mean, there's a few different trainings that came out. This is a great one, you know, when you start there, you know, because again, you've had countless pipelines that have burst. Okay, natural gas pipelines in residential areas, except, you know, how can we better prepare for these types of incidents? What do we need? Do we need different type of equipment, specialized? Do we need stockpiles of absorbent materials? Myself personally, you know, I've talked to people, and what I would like to see is pick 4 sites within the state and have each of the sites equipped to handle up to a 250,000 gallon spill. Okay,
It's gonna have to be way more than that.
that way, within hours, you can be to a scene, and within 24 hours or less, you'll have enough capacity to handle a 1 million gallon spill in the state. And then you have people that are trained in how to deal with it, how to handle it, and you become a resource to that community that's dealing with it. Okay, the other thing is they can stay current with the most up-to-date technology on how to treat and handle these incidents.
But there's only one product on the market that it can absorb an oil spill right now.
No, there's more than that.
There's more than
There's
that.
far more than that.
There was not, I can tell you that, there's not.
Well,
We do need to move along though, because we're about to run out of time. Do you have a few more slides that you need to hit here?
No, I think that's the last one.
Yeah, all right.
Perfect timing. Great information.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
You've got all my contact information, so if anybody's got any questions in the future or anything comes up, by all means, feel free to give me a call or contact me, and I'll give you the answers. In the meantime,
I'm gonna be talking to you all.
Weird.
You want to say?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's one of those, it's really tricky. It's really tricky.
it is, I know, that's
It's not black and white.
the people that are paying are the ones that are going to cut corners.
Yeah,
And
every
that's why
time.
they shouldn't be in charge.
That's right. That's exactly what I'm saying. I went and I looked at air monitoring, they haven't done these, they haven't yet.
Hi, Janelle.
We're going to take a really quick break, everybody needs to run to the restroom, and April's going to give some information on
I'm
the
gonna get a copy of the slide with all of the